Good afternoon, and welcome. I'm really pleased this afternoon to be able to introduce two really impressive activist scholars who are engaged in the role of heritage in social relations, in making our world better. I'm Uzi Baram. I'm professor of anthropology and director of the College Public Archaeology Lab. And I've spent a good chunk of my career working as a public archaeology on issues of heritage and thinking about concerns with memory and history. And for this afternoon's presentation, we're going to work towards understanding how those dynamics of the past can be helpful in the pursuit of justice and making this a better world. I'm not going to do long introductions. I really do want the speakers to introduce themselves, but I do want to say how happy I am that Sofia Ali-Khan has returned to New College. Sofia graduated from this august college back in 1996. I arrived in 1997, so we did not overlap. Exactly. But a mutual friend put us in touch. And as she was working on her book, A Good Country, Sofia came down and we just engaged in wonderful conversation about the history and heritage of Sarasota, and some of that information is found in one of the chapters of her book, A Good Country. And so this is a real treat, and I'm just going to turn the microphone over right now so we can hear some vignettes about the past of the US and hopefully the future as well.
Thanks, Uzi. Okay, so it feels really strange to be talking to a microphone in Ham Center. I feel like Ham Center was historically like the site of me walking around sleepless and barefoot, and not a place where I held a microphone in my hands and sat on a tall chair. But here we go. I could do a couple of things. I could tell a story, which is what I prepared, do a sort of talk with some stories in it, which is what I prepared for Stainer Pavilion tonight. Or I could do a short reading from the book. And I'm gonna leave that up to you. What do you all want to hear? Would you like vignettes? Would you like a reading? You'd like the vignettes? Okay. All right, so as Uzi mentioned, I arrived at New College in August of 1992. And I had picked New College out of a book, sight unseen. I'd never stepped foot on campus, but there was this line in the Insider's Guide to the Colleges that said, when you go out to dance in the rain at 2 a.m., you'll find that there's somebody already there. And that felt like that might be my place. So my parents, who are both Pakistani immigrants, really didn't love that idea. They were not inclined to dance in the rain at 2 a.m. and they didn't really want me to be doing that either. But I showed up, and it's true that New College is a really magical place, but at the time, it was very much an island apart from the rest of Sarasota and Bradenton. I know that it still probably is that, but believe it or not, it's less so than it was then. And the faculty and the curriculum were fairly homogenous and very narrow at that time. Not just at New College, but I think in general, college level curricula were much more narrow. And so I found it very difficult as a student to attach to what was being taught. I couldn't find my way in. I couldn't find a foothold because I was looking for a protagonist, not just in literature, but in social sciences, across the humanities, that looked like me, where my intellectual interests, or I guess I didn't even really know what my intellectual tradition was coming from Pakistan. And I wanted someone to help me locate myself in that tradition so that I could connect to other traditions. And instead I sort of found myself floating. And this is true in spite of the fact that Sarasota and Bradenton have their own rich history as a multi-ethnic, multicultural margin, where persecuted people have built lives of peace and dignity, created new models of freedom and liberty for hundreds of years. One of the reasons I came down to interview Uzi for the book, A Good Country, is because so much of his work touches on that history, really uncovers that history for the first time. And then through him, I met Vickie Oldham and looked at the Newtown Alive website and realized that that history is actually far longer and broader than I could have ever imagined being here on the campus. And so this talk is a little bit an effort to make some of those connections, to build that curiosity, because it's really enriched my life to come back and make these connections with Vickie and with Uzi. And I hope it will be for you too, to make those connections. So it turns out that I had missed the clues both on and off campus that might have better led me to understand that history earlier. I missed similar clues all through college and after college, in the neighborhood where I'd grown up, and again in the neighborhood where my children took their first steps. I have a 10 and a 12-year-old. My public schools in Pennsylvania, just as schools today in Florida, I'm sure you all know, tend to discourage students from understanding the origins of our stratified society, from following clues that might lead us to investigate America's pervasive color lines in particular. Today, Florida is ground zero for this phenomenon, right? With legislation that bans books reflecting the diversity of our nation and limiting civics and history curricula. That's why I feel so invested in coming back to talk to you today. So I didn't start digging up the histories of color lines until December of 2015. So in December of 2015, I was the not-so-young mom of 2 young children living in suburban Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is, for those of you who don't know, a very purple county, very much a bellwether of what's going on politically all over the country. And I'd been by then a public interest lawyer for 15 years. I'd worked in some of America's poorest neighborhoods with some of America's most vulnerable communities. But I was clinging to this idea that the moral arc of America bent inevitably towards justice. I really believed that that was the end of the story, no matter what we would do. And when President Obama said to hope, I hoped. But then Trump campaigned, and he campaigned on banning Muslims like me. And I felt like the moral arc of America had taken a really hard right turn away from justice, at least for my family and my community. So I was stuck on this thought that racism in America had gone through this really remarkable evolution, right? So even though in the preceding 20 years, it had become so indefensible to be racist that even racists didn't want to be called racist anymore, Trump was managing to create an environment in which Muslims were being racialized as Muslims. So we were being racialized in all of the same ways as other groups: feared, loathed, exotified, detained, criminalized, deported, right? And I felt like I really needed to investigate what this might mean for my own children. And so even though I had worked in vulnerable communities all over the country, I wanted to go back and take the time that so few of us are able to in busy lives to reconstruct the histories of the color lines I'd been tripping over all my life. So I'm racially ambiguous. I pass in some places, I don't pass in other places. I often hear things I'm not really supposed to hear because people assume that I'm not what I am. And so I went back and thought through the color lines I had tripped over in 12 American towns all over the country. Each chapter in the book is a different town. So what I do is I tell you the story of the color line I tripped over, and then I tell you the backstory of that color line and how it got there. So there are dozens of these stories in the book. I'm going to tell you just 4 of them today. In an effort to talk about how we're often fed these sort of moments, these iconic moments of progress or liberty, but then when you zoom out and you take into account what leads up to that moment and what comes after, the moment of liberty seems much more slippery. And I tell these stories not as a way to diminish hope, because I think hope is really important. I tell these stories as a way of saying, we can't have the real conversations we need to have about important things like reparations and highways and water and energy unless we know the whole story, okay? So the first story I'm going to tell is set right here on the new college campus. Let me catch up to myself here. All right, so the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus was undoubtedly an iconic American institution. It's hard in these days of Netflix to remember why, but in 1870s America, the American traveling circus seemed to equalize access to entertainment, closing the gap in a really radical way between rich and poor. Affordable, accessible, and fantastic, the circus was theater, acrobatics, and tabloid news all in one. It was also an incredibly lucrative endeavor, allowing John Ringling to build Cottazon on the bay, though Sarasota and its infrastructure at the time were fledgling at best, and it allowed John to import clay roof shingles from Spain, park a yacht next to Mabel's gondola. It also allowed Charles to build College Hall on our campus, and his niece to build Cook Hall. But the Ringling Circus, and especially its sideshow, was a Jim Crow era sensation, something I hadn't thought about as a student here. Made up in equal parts of the supremacist wonderings of white America about how to think about black and brown people, and also the post-slavery drive to make a profit on the exploitation of newly freed black Americans. The Ringling Circus trafficked and traded in black and brown bodies like those of George and Willie Muse, who were two albino brothers who were children. They were sharecropping with their mother in southwestern Virginia. George and Willie Muse had innate musical talent, and their mother, realizing that her sons might stand to make a better and less brutal living from white America's fascination with them in a local show than from working in fields, decided to let them work for a local not traveling circus there in southwestern Virginia. But without her knowledge or consent, the boys were soon trafficked away. We would call it trafficked today. They were sold or traded to another so-called manager named Candy Shelton. Told she was dead, the boys would spend decades as a circus sideshow, marketed as Eco and Iko, the sheep-headed cannibals, the Ecuadorian savages or ambassadors from Mars. They earned the comfortable living of their white handler, named, I think I already mentioned, Candy Shelton, until their mother tracked them down one day in Roanoke. The story ends in a mass of contradictions. George and Willie briefly left the circus to rejoin their mother, but found Jim Crow Roanoke no better a life than the one they'd left behind in the circus. Remarkably, George and Willie's mom, though illiterate and poor, managed to negotiate their return, but only on the condition that payment from now on would go to the brothers themselves instead of Candy Shelton. They ultimately fared, because of her remarkable intervention, much better than other black and brown sideshows of their time. As it turns out, whether or not the American circus was a great equalizer, it depends on whether you happen to be the entertained or the entertainment. Exaggerating racial and phenotypical differences, marketing otherness was a key pillar, it turns out, of the American circus sideshow for over 100 years, well into the 20th century. And in the end, it was not ever the brown or black entertainers who built mansions on the bay. Though the story of the Ringlings is specific to New College, several American institutions of higher education have parallel stories in which they were built by enslaved labor, held enslaved people as assets, but the same institutions only began to admit substantial numbers of those black students in the civil rights era, without reparations for past wrongdoings. Okay, so during college, I won a scholarship to study the connections between arts and activism in a summer school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So you can imagine I'm this poor new college student. I'm taking endless Greyhound buses to get myself to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was insane, but something I chose to do. What I didn't know about South Dakota was what we've seen much more recently in the news. So in 2016, we've all turned our attention to South Dakota because of the Standing Rock protests. You all remember those. For the first time in 45 years, America was really paying attention to the middle of South Dakota. Maybe for the first time ever, really paying attention to indigenous interests and priorities. We learned a lot during that time. We learned that that the folks on the Standing Rock Reservation relied for their drinking water on the Oahe Reservoir, the sole source of clean drinking water to the reservation. And we learned that when you run a pipeline under a reservoir like that, it causes all kinds of health issues. But what we were all really focused on was the protests themselves. They were brilliant and remarkable. They were a real innovation in Native-led organizing. They made use of social media. They brought together a national coalition around indigenous issues that just hadn't existed before. The history that so many of us were missing, and I certainly was, is that the Standing Rock Reservation only exists because the American government breached the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, in which the Ochotee-Shakowin, also known as the Sioux, were promised the entire western half of South Dakota, including the Black Hills. And the Ochotee-Shakowin only signed that treaty because the US government had breached an earlier 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie that promised half of South Dakota, large part of Wyoming, Nebraska, and parts of 2 other states. So in 1980, the Supreme Court decided that the Black Hills were actually taken unlawfully, without compensation, to the Ochotee-Shakowin. And they ordered the US government to pay $17.5 million in restitution. But just for context, a single gold mining operation in the Black Hills recovered about $18 billion worth of ore over 126 years. So you see the difference is clear. So in the larger context of the Standing Rock protests, the moment of liberation, still beautiful, but seems fleeting. After college, I moved to Little Rock, Arkansas. And when I moved there, I think I was telling somebody this the other night, the only thing I knew about Little Rock, Arkansas, I learned in the Campus Media Center, watching the PBS Eyes on the Prize series, which in those days was on VHS cassette tape. The Media Center was pretty quiet, and so I watched the whole 16, 20 tapes, I don't know what it was. Anyway, this is sort of typical of how civil rights history is taught, right? There was one VHS tape about the desegregation of Central High. And so when I got to Little Rock, I thought the fight had already been won. I thought that was the story of desegregation in Little Rock. And it's true, for that first full year after the brave Little Rock Nine entered the doors of Central High under the guidance of Miss Daisy Bates, their mentor, they spent a full year there. But I didn't know that the very next year, the governor of Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus, closed all of the public schools in the city. And then he and the other state and municipal leaders began to plan, and they drew down an enormous amount of federal dollars over the next 3 decades. And they built a highway, like a wall, through the city. The idea was that if they couldn't segregate the schools anymore, they would segregate the town in such a hard logistical fashion that the schools could no longer be desegregated because the logistical barrier was simply too great to get over. So they supported the development of an all-white enclave in the western part of the city, which is now 40% of the modern city of Little Rock. And they built a new public school there, staffed by all-white teachers. On the eastern side of town, and this really fascinated me, I really didn't know this, they demolished black middle-class housing. Little Rock had a substantial and really complex black middle class at that time. Journalists, activists, professionals of every kind, mainly living in the Dunbar neighborhood of Little Rock. That was demolished using federal urban renewal dollars. And instead, public housing projects were built. So despite Black Little Rock having a substantial middle class, regardless of income, folks were pushed into public housing in the eastern part of the city. And so 60 years on from that moment of the desegregation of Little Rock is substantially more segregated than it ever had been in the 1950s. Just over a year after I graduated from college, I spent some time in Charlottesville, Virginia, not far from Thomas Jefferson's plantation at Monticello. In 1808, while Thomas Jefferson was president, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, and I had always pinned those two things together. I pinned the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade to Thomas Jefferson's legacy, and I mean, for a while, to his character, until I learned a little bit better. Because as it turns out, Thomas Jefferson was not interested in abolishing the slave trade, he was interested in innovating. He wanted to make sure that he and his Virginia peers were the sole suppliers of enslaved people to the new states of the Deep South, so Louisiana, Mississippi. Put on trains and marched in coffles, chained neck to neck, twice as many enslaved people were trafficked to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860 as ever arrived in the ports of the continental United States. And so in this larger story about Thomas Jefferson and his interests, the moment of liberation seems fleeting, the iconic moment of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So all of this is to say that as I studied, I found more and more of these curated pearls, these moments I had been taught about, these iconic moments of liberation. Moments built as progress that in context seemed less valuable, frankly. And I built a timeline of them. I realized that they stretched from the birth of our nation right up to today. I made a map of the cities tied to the histories, and they, it turned out, stretched from coast to coast and border to border. So I wrote the book about them called A Good Country. After the story, and it was named, that book, after the story that America tells to itself. And after the story that was really the only story about America that my parents knew when they immigrated from Pakistan in the 1960s. So I realized I'd been sold a necklace of them, out of context as the full picture of American history. And it was a story I wanted desperately to believe. It made me feel good and whole and like we were going somewhere. It really took the shift in experience of watching Trump campaign to shift that experience, to shift that understanding. It took the reality of being deeply racialized in America, I'm ashamed to admit, to make me really understand that I was living in a fully segregated society, really still an apartheid nation, with an unbroken legacy of the forced migrations of brown and black people, sometimes across town, sometimes out of town, sometimes across country or out of the country entirely, with a fair number of Americans still acting and voting like embattled colonizers. So it made me realize I wanted something different for my own children. Here's the something different, and here's the hope I promised at the beginning. So this is gonna sound like a cliche, but I promise it's not. In 2017, I moved with my family to Canada. Canada is not utopian. There's plenty of racism there. It has a very similar legacy of settler colonialism, of slavery, of indigenous genocide. Not gonna lie about that. But Canada has done a really interesting thing at the state level to sort of turn the page on, not turn the page as in cover up, but to unearth some of that history. So if you look at the Department of Justice website for Canada today, the state of Canada explicitly acknowledges that the premise of the country, the taking of land from indigenous people, is violative of modern human rights standards. And so it says, our intention, our policy is now to decolonize. I don't know about you, but this is the stuff of like left-leaning academic departments down here. If you talk about this in policy forums, you get laughed out of the room here. In Canada, it's the official policy of the state. So one of the things that I find incredibly hopeful is that things that may seem impossible from an American perspective really are not impossible if you're able to step back and look at what's happening in other Western developed nations who have this settler colonial history. Now there's a continuum of how settler colonial societies, because there are many of them around the world, are choosing to deal with their history. But on a certain side of that spectrum, states are making decisions to tell the truth. And what they're finding is that that truth-telling, the truth and reconciliation process, is opening new and brighter futures for a post-colonial possibility, right? The other thing that Canada has is it's the only country in the world that has a Multiculturalism Act. And that Multiculturalism Act says that the government has to treat people equally, but also has to commit to celebrating and respecting diversity. That sounds soft. It sounds like, oh yeah, we do that in America, right? But we don't. If you look at the history, America promises equality, but usually in exchange for assimilation. And it's a really profound thing for a settler colonial state to say we no longer demand the assimilation piece of that equation. So trying to imagine what comes after colonization is difficult, complicated work. In Canada, in the US. Those of us living in diaspora can't turn back the clock and slip back into indigeneity. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up on integrity or justice or peace. Chasing iconic moments of liberty for the most dispossessed among us is an important part of that work, but it's also really important that we understand what comes before the moment and what comes after it, after the iconic moment has passed. So that once we achieve those moments of liberty, we can be sure that they don't just slip away.
Thank you, Sophia, for those words, yes. And we are here in Sarasota, where for 20,000 years, Native Americans lived on this land, gathered into and settled, had children, had grandchildren. 500 years ago, the Spanish came and reordered the world. The ancestors of the Seminole Mississippi people have descendants who are still with us. But other people came and settled the land. Some came to escape enslavement, created a large-scale community of freedom seekers that lasted for decades until it was destroyed in 1821. Others, great hamlets on the coastline, where they fished, got their Havana market, and ultimately had to give up that way of life in the 1840s. And then more and more people came and created this contemporary Sarasota and Manatee. Remembering that is quite difficult. Understanding it even more so, and situating ourselves in that broad history is something that I think people still grapple with. Sophia gives, in a good country, a national view of all these issues, as you just said, from coast to coast, border to border, over 12 places that have been replicated hundreds more times across the country, and all those different stories. It is a tremendous challenge to look at those issues. Similar to Sophia, immigrants, so my family doesn't have that history here. And I had to learn it. My parents took me to museums and told me to study. And I did read a lot. I do work very quickly as soon as it arrived, because I do that. How to continue telling those stories and to awaken people, I think, is one of our real challenges. Sarasota is incredibly fortunate to have someone that came out of the community to really animate the history. I've known Vickie Oldham for 18 years. I think Hebrew High for life. So yes, a lifetime together as collaborators is the way I'll see it. First in the Looking for Enola project, and then with Newtown Alive. As I was thinking about this program, I want you to meet Sofia Ali-Khan. I want you to think about her book and read it. I also want you to hear what's happening with the Sarasota African American Cultural Center Museum, because it is extraordinary what's happening here in Sarasota on a national stage or an international stage. And Vickie is very modest about it. But I think hearing what's going on should connect very nicely to the story of a good country. So please welcome Vickie Oldham.
Thank you. Thank you, Uzi. Listening to you and your experiences here in Sarasota, I'm drawing all sorts of parallels. I was born and reared here in Sarasota, and I guess I was on the cusp of some sort of change. My team does trolley tours now for residents and visitors who've never heard this history before, and I tell them that when I came up through Newtown, there were things happening in our history, but as a 10-year-old and as a 12-year-old, I could not process it. And the adults were not explaining to us what was going on. I could hear whispers of something happened to Dr. John Chenault, but I just couldn't put it together what was going on. I heard whispers of some young men had drowned in a train car. But I didn't know that they could not go, African Americans could not go to Sarasota County beaches to enjoy the sand and surf. So those boys were in that train car just trying to splash around in the water because they could not go to the beach. I didn't know that, but it was not until I left Sarasota, worked in higher education, learning marketing and communications, and coming back here, and then being awarded the contract to document the history of Newtown, that I really began to put some pieces together. In high school, it was not taught at Riverview. I went to Riverview High School. And as high school students, we push for a recognition of Black History Month in February. It was not something that was just normally going to be done. We noticed, hey, nobody's talking about Black History Month around here. So we went to the administration and said we want to do a Black History program, and so they allowed us to do it. But it wasn't until I started documenting this history that I began to understand some things about Sarasota. And to be honest with you, it was appalling. You know, this beautiful city that I love, with these beautiful palm trees and beaches and all, I got to know a different side of it that I had not understood before. And to be honest with you again, at the end of the research period, I was very, very angry upon learning about the lynching that occurred when Sarasota was a part of Manatee County. No one had ever talked to me about lynching. In fact, we were about to close the research report and publish the book. It was already at the printer when Brian Stevenson came to speak to the Bar Association here as a keynoter, and he started talking about lynching, and somewhere between the chicken and the dessert, I thought, lynching in Sarasota cannot be. That cannot be. And I started searching like, oh my God, if there was lynching history in Sarasota and it's not in that research report, shame on me. But it here's what happened. We had to go ahead and print it, but that story nudged that caused me to go look for lynching history, and boy, oh boy, did I find it. I found it in a research report in a database at UCF, University of South Florida database. But when I found out, we were actually able to include this information in a book called Newtown Alive that was based on that history, that research report. Uzi introduced me as someone who he wants to update you on this Sarasota African American Cultural Coalition facility. A lot of work had to happen before we got to this stage of actually opening a facility here in Sarasota, Florida, an African American Cultural Coalition. Ooh. Anyway, a good foundation was laid with that research report that I was telling you about. The city of Sarasota hired my team to do this work. And so they had some specific deliverables: research report, oral history, interviews, some educational materials. I figured after I finished that work, that phase one, that I could go back to my career in higher education, marketing and communications in Georgia, and finish out my time, and just retire, and then come on back to live a comfortable life in Sarasota, Florida. Got my retirement income. Well, no, it did not happen like that. The city of Sarasota had a phase 2. And they awarded it to my team. And I thought, okay, another year of my life, and then I'll get back to Georgia and work on my retirement. Phase 2 was historic markers about the history of Sarasota's Black community and the digital imprint, website, mobile app. And after doing that, it occurred to me, and after listening to residents say that they wanted an African American History Museum, in closing, in presenting the final report to commissioners about phase 2 and 1, I did pitch to them the need for an African American Arts and History Center. And they awarded my team a measly $200,000, that's not a lot of money, to find a location and to open a facility. It's just enough to, I was grateful, but it was a yeoman's task to take this little money and do something really, really big with it. Working at historically Black colleges and universities, as I was doing in Georgia, I had some experience in working with a small amount of money and making something really, really big out of it. And so we found, I can't say we found a location. We didn't find a location. After George Floyd was murdered, the city administrators here said, we have come into possession of an historic house. It's a small historic house. It's the Leonard Reed House. It's only 1,400 square feet. You're looking for a facility. Maybe you can start in that facility. We didn't have anything, so I said, yeah, we can do it, sure. And they also said that the developer who owned the house needed to move the house off of his property so that he could put a 3-story office building there where an African American community once was located. This area called Rosemary District, that's what you know it as. We know it as Overtown. It's totally gentrified now. But anyway, the developer wanted to move that house, and it was going to be placed in Newtown on city-owned property. Again, I had my searches for land and a facility hadn't turned up anything, and so I said yes. Now, after talking with Black museum makers around the country, they were telling me that they were not putting these facilities in African American communities because these communities, people don't make a whole bunch of money and they can't sustain them. They can't keep them running. They were building these facilities near riverfronts where tourists frequented, because tourists bring money here to spend, and they spend a lot. Here it is, I have a small historic house and it's going to be placed smack dab in the middle of the African American community. I said yes, whatever. I will do the best that I can. And that is what we're doing, the best that we can. The house was moved in May at 3 a.m. in the morning. We were all, well, many of my team members, we were awake and watching the house hitched up to a huge flatbed truck and moved down the street. And it was the most glorious, sight. You know, it was just a very, very emotional sight, because I know the history of the man who owned that house. His name was Leonard Reed, and he came here in 1900, and he didn't plan to stay here in Sarasota, just as I had not planned to stay. He was on his way to Cuba to get into the fish industry, and there was a party going on in that Rosemary, well, Overtown area, the Black community, and he stayed too long, and he got left. He went back to the boat after a couple of days, and the boat had already left him. So he had to make a way for himself here in Sarasota, so he did odd jobs. But the African American people realized, man, he's educated, he's very educated. So they introduced him to Colonel John Gillespie, and Gillespie hired Leonard Reed, and he began to run the colonel's house, and he became the right-hand man of the colonel. But I didn't understand my connection to Leonard Reed until I started doing this research. Well, how about Leonard Reed's daughters were my first teachers in a little Black day nursery facility in the Newtown community. It was, wow, that was a wow moment for me, that I have a connection to this house that I'm going to turn into an African American Arts and History Center. So right now, the city has invested $400,000 to hook this house up to its utilities, electricity. It's putting in air conditioning units. It's going to put a beautiful landscaping package on the grounds, and they're going to build, say, a covered patio, and it'll have a little parking lot, and we'll do programs in that house, and hopefully we'll show the work that you've done, Uzi, in unearthing the artifacts of Angola, and we'll have other small exhibits, and we'll focus on the artwork of young Black artists. And most definitely we'll be telling the history of the Overtown community and the Newtown community, because it's a glorious history that nobody really had told in a grand way until this research study started. And this project has turned into something very special and much larger than I ever had in mind. I'll let you ask questions from there, Uzi, but it's transformative, and it started with me first. I'll say this and I'll give you the mic. As a Black girl growing up in Sarasota, Florida, yes, in my immediate neighborhood, I saw Black people, Black pastors, Black funeral directors, and entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs. But outside of my community, I did not see Black people in control of anything, really. And so the point that I'm trying to get across to Sarasota is that this facility is really important to Black children, especially since we can't teach them African American history in schools anymore. Here's the difference that it made to me, for me. When I went to work at historically Black colleges and universities, I saw a Black university president, Black VPs, vice presidents, department chairs. I saw Black students in an academic environment. This was so beautiful. This is not what I saw in Sarasota, and it raised my confidence in myself and in my own ability to do things and to be great and to run things. It was amazing. It gave me courage, it gave me dignity, it gave me a determination that I did not have so much. Well, I had it, but it got real big when I came back here from having been in that environment at the HBCUs.
Thank you, Vickie, for that overview and the personal aspects of the significance of the past. I come from a faith tradition that has as its central imperative to remember. Just remember. And remembering has a lot of pleasantries and a lot of pain. And in this land, there's a lot of pain. And there are wounds, and there's need for healing. So I actually want to start asking Sofia to kind of comment and try to imagine this museum, this cultural center, this center of arts, this inspiration for a rising generation, and how that can help us heal and make this country that your parents believed in, this good country that they came to and still believe, because that's also my story. How would this healing help us reach that good country?
So that's a really interesting question. At first I was going to say, that's a question for Vickie. You got to ask Vickie that question. But it really does connect because, so interestingly, so when my parents immigrated from Pakistan, my dad immigrated in the early 60s to go to University of British Columbia. This is like, you have to imagine pre-internet days, but also you're in Hyderabad, Pakistan. Like there's not reliable electricity. Clean drinking water is very iffy. You're boiling water all the time. You're like, he's like going to the university and flipping through a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopied application for a school that he doesn't even have a way to verify exists on the other side of the world. Like that's how he's accessing higher education. And so when they came, or when my dad came, he was about 21 years old. He had been born 5 years before British colonization of South Asia ended. So he was actually born in British India. So his perspective on his own history was very limited, in the sense that if you asked him who built the schools, who built the railroads, who built the highways, the answer was the British. Because one of the aims of colonization is to make it seem like the colonizer brought everything good and you weren't anything before they arrived. And so there was no living memory after 100 years of the East India Company being in South Asia, and then another 100 years of the British, very specifically the British government, the British Empire controlling South Asia. There was no living memory of who the Mughals were, who built the wealth of South Asia. I just recently read that South Asia was generating, at the time that the British arrived, 23% of global wealth they were generating. And Britain was generating something like 3%. 200 years later, by the time they had left, after a whole bunch of exploitation, destroying legislation, destroying industries, really concerted efforts to transform that, those ratios flipped. So Britain became the engine of the Industrial Revolution, built on cotton, and on brown and black folks growing cotton. And South Asia was producing in the single digits of wealth. So I didn't know that, and he didn't either. So he for sure did not understand that he was coming to a place where that same history was replicated in the history of American slavery and the history of the theft of land from indigenous people, right? Now, I'm not saying those are the same histories, but I am saying he didn't understand he was trading one colonial history for another colonial project that was still going on. He had no way of understanding that, and the reason he had no way of understanding that was because of the lack of the storytelling and education broadly in our educational systems, right? Because no British colonizer is going to say, hey, let me tell you about what we're doing to you. Let me tell you about the shipping industry we destroyed. Let me tell you how we burned your looms. Let me tell you how we, exported your foods that were genocides in Bangladesh, right? Like, they're not going to do that. And so we have a responsibility to go find those histories. And what I find so amazing about Vickie's work is that she's not only excavating those histories, she's making them popularly available. The internet is this incredible machine, and I have to tell you, you all need to go to the Newtown Alive website after I leave here today. Because it is, I was like, she was like, calm down. I was at dinner last night, like, I can't believe this website. It's a timeline of the civil rights history and just the incredible audacity of people who were being limited by the society, the laws, the social structures around them, just continuing to be present, continuing to refuse to be erased, continuing to go places where they weren't wanted and weren't accepted, whether it was being a school first of all, opening schools in their own community and then becoming school principals of white schools where they weren't supposed to be there, making sure their kids could then go to integrated schools, making sure the beaches were integrated. That history is profound in Sarasota, and none of it would be accessible to most of us if it hadn't been for Vickie's work. So I feel like one of the most hopeful things, you look around and, we just had these elections, and we all know what Ron DeSantis is actually, right? But why is he up to it? He's up to it because incredible work is being done that challenges the way that things have always been. We're winning, and people don't like it. And what I mean by we're winning is we're telling the stories and people are learning their own history, and they're being empowered by it. I mean, your story is phenomenal, right? Like, to sort of change the face of your hometown the way you have, and make that a gift of history to all of us.
I had no idea that this was happening, really. I just, when I learned about the Angola story, it touched me so deeply because I was in a personal transition myself, and I read what these formerly enslaved people did to survive. And it spoke to me, it ministered to me, and told me if they could survive what they survived, then surely you ought to be able to go through what you're going through, young woman. So I thought, okay, it's helped me. Let me see if I can help somebody else, because somebody else needs to hear this story. So as a journalist, knowing how to write and put video together, I thought, okay, I'll tell a documentary story. And that is all that I had in mind to do, was tell a short documentary with money, that the little money that I had. $4,000 ain't a lot of money. But anyway, I did learn that some more work needed to be done with this Angola story. For instance, archaeology had to be done. So here we are birthing. We're birthing an Angola, a looking for Angola project to find artifacts. Suddenly it's already bigger than I had in mind. Oh, by the way, I do get to tell the story. I did tell the story, about 10 minutes worth, with, you know, that. But I was learning along the way how to share. And Uzi was this big public archaeology guy. This was the term that he used, public archaeology. What's that? Bringing archaeology out of academia into the public and explaining to them how it works and sharing what he's gonna do in their community and getting input from them. And so my mind it started opening up to all of this. Do you remember?
Oh yeah. Oh, I remember it really clearly because in fact it wouldn't have happened without you. That having someone from the community dedicated to the history made all the difference in the world. Academics have written about these issues, these concerns. The Maroon community was published in a 1990 academic article. It was sitting there. I had read the article. Remember, I read a lot. That's the immigrant story, right? Scribe and always read. And probably a couple of dozen of us had read it. You read it and realized more people need to know it.
Yeah.
I had no answer for that. How to get more people to know. You provided all of those levers. You provided, and I'll share this with you all as I'm holding this microphone. I didn't know how to speak to a reporter at that point. You actually explained to me how to talk to reporters. And, well, it's a skill set.
Yeah.
And nowhere in my undergrad career or my graduate training had anyone ever spent a second in any class, in any office hour, in any kind of grad students sitting together drinking beer. How do you talk to the media? You told me how to stand there, where to look, and really the key, because I'm an academic, how to pause so they can cut what I'm saying and take the 30 seconds that they wanted from me and not speak for 3-4 minutes straight where they can't do anything with it. And reporters have said since then, wow, this is useful. Yes, because I was trained, but also you brought that personal aspect. That this is meaningful. Right? That's the whole notion of heritage, which is what my career has moved to. Yes, I'm trained in archaeology, capable of excavating, capable of overseeing laboratory work and writing about it, trained in anthropology, I know how to do persistent observation, I know how to do ethnographic interviews, all that's there, and scientific reports. How do we go to those next levels? How do we get there? That's what we have provided, that energy that has moved things so much. And as we think about this, right, and I think clearly Professor Lee has a national and international view. Right? My parents also were born in British colonialism, British mandatory Palestine, so we share that commonality. It's like a different sort of colonial group, but enough of the same. And then my parents came here as well with that sense of a good country. And then this just amazing dynamic here in Sarasota. And I think as we look at the audience, as you said a few times, I think quite appropriately, there's kind of two audiences for this. To build a cultural center, museum, facility, whatever you're going to be calling this place, does take resources. Looking for Angola project required resources for the filming, required resources for getting shovels and screens, and pay excavators and volunteers, needed to conserve the materials. It does, there's resources. And so on one level, there's that question of who's going to step up and provide resources. But we also here at New College of Florida, and we have undergraduates in the room who don't have financial resources, and we're not asking for that. As you think about it and asking that to kind of think out loud, we've talked a little bit about having undergraduates help with grant proposals so that they would write real grant proposals. Because it takes time to read a proposal, to see what they want. Every foundation has bureaucratic things they want checked off. It takes effort to kind of get that information together. Actually sit down and write it, and then just making sure that support letters and the rest. There's a lot of logistics involved in grant writing, so undergraduates can help with that. What else, before I turn to you, what else would you see the undergraduates contributing? But first, you guys going to comment.
Sorry, so what I would love to just jump in and say very quickly is that one of the things I didn't understand about myself as an undergraduate here on the new college campus is that the campus doesn't contain you. Research libraries, there's so much that's online right now. JSTOR, I can get a JSTOR subscription, so you certainly can. Like, the sky's the limit with researching who you are. Because this isn't just about immigrant history, African American history. This is about you knowing who you are here. This is about your history, your place. Where did you come from? Where are you going? And all of those things are available to you. So if you don't see it in the curriculum, or even if you do, don't be afraid to go look at archival research. I mean, that's what both Vickie and I did in our work, was like, I spent hours in the Pennsylvania Historical Society. I'm telling you, I was the only one in there, so the librarians were all over me. Like, nobody goes into these places. But I was putting my hands on the original deeds between William Penn and Lenape leaders, right? I could see where they were specious. I could see where they said, I agree to give from this tree over there to that bend in the river for as much as William Penn deems reasonable to give me. And I could see that they weren't reasonable contracts. When you put your hands on those documents that relate to a place that you have lived, a place that you feel a personal connection to, it changes you. I don't know if I can convey it any better than Vickie's stories conveyed it, because that was so beautiful, but I just want to make sure that you know that all of that is available to each of you. And I just know that if I would have wanted someone when I was a new college student to tell me that that's what I was here to do, to find myself in all of these papers and all of these articles, to figure out what my life meant, my place meant, figure out my location in it, because that's where the magic happens, right?
I'd say, and I'll ask you to repeat your question, but early on when this started, I started developing wish lists of what I wanted to see happen. You know, and I'd let myself dream and just think about it as far as my imagination could go. I found a sheet. I wrote some email to somebody. Oh, this was a potential funder. February 19, 2006, looking for a goal of future projects. Underwater archaeology, educational materials for students, more historical research, feature-length documentary, theater adaptation, Angola art exhibit, cultural exchange program with Bahamian teachers and students, a national register designation when artifacts are found, a commemorative program, cultural tourism, a freedom tour, lists and lists of things that I wanted to see happen. And I looked at all these lists and I said, you know what, there is no way I'm going to be able to do all of this. And my prayer was that people in the community, students at New College, Ringling College, wherever, would see the importance of this work and getting it out on the, in public, and would just take a piece of it, whatever they felt was important to them, that they had a skill at. Say, children's book, say cookbook, say anything, any skill that anybody had. And so I am seeing that beginning to come to fruition now, because I understand that I have some limitations. You know, I can't do it all.
Well, and thinking about that list, you did most of them. right? So,
Did you notice that?
yes. The Manatee Mineral Spring is on the National Park Service Network to Freedom. It's on National Historic Preservation. We've done the underwater archaeology. There have been songs written about Angola. There's spoken word poetry. High school kids, there's a novel that was written. High school kids have done history projects. And what you didn't even dream of doing, 3 times, descendants from the Bahamas have come and celebrated in now what is, with COVID, it skipped a couple of years, but 3 times an annual festival where the descendants of Angola who found liberty in Andros Island in the Bahamas have been able to return and eat and sing and celebrate on the place where their ancestors had been and have been inspired by this. And I think this is one of the things, and I will turn to you all and see your comments in a few moments, but I think it's so important because Sofia lays out, it's really the hard challenges of history. And that there's a lot to go through. It is hard. And there's a lot of hope there, but it comes from healing those wounds. One of the things that Vickie was able to do so well, and it was your leadership. I know you're so modest. You're so modest about it. The descendants welcomed us and our work. Right? I was born in Israel. I'm a professor here because I'm a professor. They see me as part of this endeavor. They have tied their history to the work I've done and welcomed me. Cantor Brown Jr., who's the historian involved, Rosin Howard, who's a cultural anthropologist involved, you and so many others. Very much that sense that Back to Angola Festival we had just a couple of weeks ago, it is now a family event. And we're part of that family. That the kid ties, because we've invested so much in this history and tried our best to do it, it's a common endeavor. And I think when we think about those lines that divide, even those who historically have been oppressed, when done with an open heart, with a commitment to moving forward, we heal the wounds and we move better and more forward together. I think a lot of this heritage work allows us to do so. So I'm hoping we continue to do so and inspire more to do and do more and heal more of the wounds that are on this land. So thank you so much for doing all that. I do want to hear from folks who've been sitting and listening, whether you have questions, commentary, or stories. Do you want to share some of what you have?
Is there another microphone I can take that? Anybody have any questions or comments?
Hello. Thank you. So my question is for Sofia. So you mentioned, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to recount what you were saying, but you said that you are Muslim, correct? And you also shared the kind of the government, Canada's government, or I guess you said the state of Canada, some of the work that it's doing to decolonize and to decolonize in a way, or the approach being non-assimilative, right? So I was curious, in your experiences, have you come across anything specific in terms of the Islamic community and the non-assimilative, I guess, approaches, or the environment, the differences between Canada and the United States? Any specifics that you could offer there or share that you've noticed in your time in Canada?
Absolutely. So I can talk a little bit about it specifically relating to the Muslim community, but then also there are just sort of broad ways in which you see the implementation of not the full scope of decolonization, because I mean, colonization was, we're talking about 500 years of global history, right? So it's a process that none of us can see the end of or even predict the success of, right? So a lot of damage was done, a lot of institutions were created, right? So with regard to Muslims, one of the things I'll say is that One of the moments leading up to our decision as a family to move to Canada was that my daughter, who was 6 years old then, we had moved back to be closer to my parents in Bucks County. We moved back with 2 little kids, 3 and 5 years old. My daughter started kindergarten, and she had an undiagnosed chronic illness that we were trying to sort out. And Trump was campaigning. So I went and met with her her kindergarten teachers. And I walk in, and she has 2 kindergarten teachers for the upcoming fall. And one of them I graduated high school with. So I'm surprised to see her, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna be so much easier. I've come with my little sheet about Islam and Muslims, and I sit down and I say, you know, here are my daughter's health issues, I wanna talk to you about them. And then I say, and I also wanna talk to you about the fact that we're Muslim. There's a lot of vitriol in the environment right now. I'm here as a resource. Here are some things about Islam and Muslims that you might wanna know. But just think of me as a friend. I'm on call for you. And later that year, I discovered that although my daughter was in fact the only Muslim student in the school, there was one Muslim teacher who sometimes jumped in as a supply person in the kindergarten classroom. So I told my daughter, I was like, you know, Miss So-and-so is also Muslim. You can go and tell her you're celebrating Ramadan. I thought it would be a safe place for her. Oh, I should back up and say when I was speaking to the 2 kindergarten teachers, I said, you know, I'm just concerned that depending on which way the election goes, things might be hard for our family. And my old classmate looks at the other teacher and says, well, whichever way it goes, there are gonna be problems. And my heart sank, because I was like, you know, this is the moment for you to be an ally. And you're telling me you can't be an ally, that there's something in the room that I don't know about, and you can't affirm the security of my daughter. So then, fast forward to me telling my daughter there's another Muslim teacher in the building, and my daughter goes to her, 6 years old, says, Miss So-and-so, we're celebrating Ramadan too. And the teacher says, and I don't blame the teacher because I think she had a read on what was going on in that school, looked at my daughter and said, we don't talk about that at school. Now I'm an 80s kid, so I grew up with Holocaust education. If it's not safe for a kid to say who they are at school, that's a problem. That's alarm bells for me. So by contrast, in Canada, in Ontario, where my family lives, I'm getting ready for my kids' first year there, right? In 2017, we move up there. School starts the next month. And I'm getting ready with my little list of who Muslims are, what we do, and all that. And the school sends around an email listing 200 celebrations that they're acknowledging. It's like Chinese New Year, and it's like the birthday of Guru Nanak, and it's like, I mean, we're doing all of the celebrations. And it seems like such a small thing, but what it meant was, your child is safe here. That's what it meant. That was what was underneath the celebrations. Your child is going to be loved in this environment. And it was, I'm telling you as a parent, it was such a relief to know that my ill and not yet diagnosed 6, 7, 8-year-old was not going to go into an environment where she had to do battle to be who she was. Where she could, because you know, I put my kids to bed, I'm like, Mama loves you, Baba loves you, so-and-so loves you, so-and-so loves you, but Allah Sai, Allah is, of course, God, and Sai is this honorific that we have. Allah Sai loves you most of all of everyone. And Allah's love is the best love because He loves you from inside your own, and they yell heart. I mean, it's a source, whatever you call something greater than yourself that gives you comfort, that's what it is for my kids. It's a source of comfort and love, you know? We all have things like that. And I was devastated that my kids were gonna have to feel like that was under attack. And it was such a relief there to know that that was being affirmed for them by the institution that I was entrusting them with all day, every day. One other example of that, the kids in 3rd grade in Ontario's curriculum learn about settler colonialism. They actually have a unit that's standard all across at least our province, if not the country, where they talk about what it meant that folks came in and took land from indigenous people. They're told very clearly that the circumstances were immoral, dishonest, violent. They don't come home devastated. They came home to the dinner table and they were like, Mama, we have to understand that we are settlers here and that comes with some responsibilities. I mean, this was not disempowering. They were being told the truth about where they are in the world, and it was empowering to them. They were like, we understand the mission, and we are going to talk to you about proceeding with that mission. 3rd grade. And I hear the conversations here, by contrast, about how this is going to torment people and how it's going to inevitably be about a race war. And that is nonsense. You know what I mean? I feel like we are doing ourselves a disservice by not allowing ourselves to have honest conversations, and I think the honest conversations themselves are healing. And I think being able to acknowledge that many, if not most of us, are living in diaspora. You know, like we all have to figure out what it means to live in a society where most of us are not indigenous, and where we go from here. It's just an honest conversation. And I find that those conversations, the more honest they are, the more beautiful they are. I wanted to say, David's here, so I wanted to say, one of the people that I think about what I was saying before about finding your place and rooting yourself in home, David had a student who was a classmate of mine, Lisa Stempninsky, brilliant sociology major. She made a decision around her thesis to go home and to interview folks who were homeless in New York City. She was from there, and so going back to where she was from empowered her to be human in that place in a way, because she was learning about home. That she did this really brilliant, I thought, original research, oral histories, interviews, that few of us dared to do, and I think it was because coming home to figure out what's going on in our homes itself is empowering. It takes us places and it gives us a creativity as scholars that we don't get any other way, because we know our homes best. We have all of the passion that's wrapped up in place when we go back there. So I just offered that as an example. I think about Lisa a lot when I think about what I maybe should have done as a thesis student here at New College. Yeah.
I was at a journalism conference and at a workshop, and one of the presenters said, and some of you all need to just go on home and do journalism in your hometowns and all. And I remember specifically grumbling under my voice, I am not going back home to do that. That is not going to be me. Lo and behold, this is exactly what I am doing. I also wanted to say, I am learning about how to articulate what I have done, what I have developed through just reading the Sarasota magazine article. I was like, oh, that's what it is. And a friend of mine does research on reparations, and I always thought that, just like probably the general public, reparations means somebody, the government has got to pay African Americans for what they have been through and so forth. But my friend's research says that museums and monuments and plaques and apologies and websites and mobile apps and historic markers and podcasts and research reports and books are a way of honoring what our ancestors did and what they suffered, and this is a part of their honor and reparations. And I thought, wow, I didn't know, I didn't think about it that way.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say that basically everything that you've talked about is really beautiful and important and really resonated with me, and especially like what you said about how near the beginning, how you were talking about how sort of the narrative of social progress that we've been fed is sort of these carefully curated pearls, like that have been chosen, that it's not like they're lies, but the way that they've been assembled is sort of dishonest, and that it's kind of a revelation once you start to like unpack the real history and like what's actually been going on beyond the narrative you've been fed. See, I'm currently in my thesis year, and I'm trying to start to work on my thesis, and part of it involves looking at stuff like regenerative agriculture and like sort of more like indigenous modes of living with the land. And so, I mean, or just like acknowledging the deep and painful history of settler colonialism and racism in this country. And maybe like, I would wonder if you would talk a little bit more about how, well, again, like addressing this history and its completeness can lead to real healing.
Well, I think one of the things I stumbled on in the research for this book was notions of the land back movement among Indigenous folks. And there's actually this incredible resource online, and I can't remember the name of the website, but it's like the Decolonization Atlas. And they have a map on there that actually color codes land that's been given back to Native nations, and they color code it by who has done the giving back, sometimes private individuals, sometimes nonprofits, sometimes governments, state, local governments. And I thought it was really profound because I had no idea that as much land had been given back as had been. So I think land back is a really interesting, it's an interesting movement and direction that I didn't know had the momentum that it had. I think it has tremendous momentum in Canada, and I think it's starting to have momentum here. I think there are some really interesting initiatives around land back movements that target national park land, and sort of considering what Indigenous stewardship of national park land would look like as a way to jumpstart land back and start to allow Native nations, or First Nations as we call them in Canada, to start to re-implement the practices that are still codified in oral histories, but that there isn't enough of a land base to implement. So it'd be really interesting to sort of see those kinds of initiatives have state backing and have funding. I mean, as Vickie said several times, so much of this depends on funding. Like, we each have a capacity to change our environments in these dramatic ways, but so much of our constraints are funding. So, I mean, I think that's a really powerful sort of beginning. I don't know if that really answers your question. I'll just mention one other thing, which is that, so there's a Lenape writer who I came across in the process of writing the book. And that's a really unique thing to say because the devastation among the Eastern tribes was much more complete than the Western nations, sorry, not tribes, nations. And he's been writing, for Huffington Post actually, articles about the process of finding his way back with some relatives to the Delaware Valley, which, as you can imagine, it includes Manhattan. It looks a lot different from what, like, the devastation is so complete, not just to the people, but to the place. It's so completely different. But it raises several things. One is figuring out a language for Native autonomy that includes space for urban Native people. and figuring out sort of what that means and what that looks like, right? So letting folks be in charge of their identities fully in the modern world and not having sort of concepts of what that looks like. But he's been doing this really interesting thing of when he does pilgrimages, specifically identifying plants, medicinal plants that exist in the oral history that many Lenape people have never seen growing in the wild because they've been displaced to Oklahoma or to Wisconsin, I want to say, Ontario, right? So they've never been in the Delaware Valley seeing these plants that they've still been using for, several tens of generations out. So there's a lot of hope there, and I think the work you're doing is really interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add and kind of maybe give a coda to some of that. It's one of these dynamics that, as an anthropologist, I actually repeat a lot, and sometimes I'm actually pretty self-conscious in my classes that I'm repeating a simple point, and the simple point sounds kind of mundane in a classroom, but it's to listen to the people. Right? It's not. It's on some level it sounds, of course. As Vickie has explained so well, right? There's that urge that people have to share what they know, and we need to hear what the elders of Sarasota have to say. We have to hear because the land is changing. It's not broken, but it's changing rapidly, and there's information, ideas, and memories that are actually going to help us navigate this Anthropocene. As Vickie made so clear, right? One way of making the change is through museums, right? Defined really broadly. For the last 25 years, particularly because of gaming money, many of the sovereign tribes have used the revenue they've gotten from gaming, including the Seminole Tribe of Florida, to create large-scale museums. They're not small things. Mohican people in Connecticut, you can actually just go around the country, the ones that have the resources so they can take care of healthcare, so they can take care of the elderly, and open up places. And they're open to the public. And they have web presences, and they have publications that come out. And it comes from people who have memories that go back tens of thousands of years, who are dedicated to stewarding the land that we need to hear. And the way to hear it, again, it sounds so mundane, so simple, but it seems like an anthropologist has repeated a lot. Listen. People are actually sharing that information. You need to go, you need to be polite, you need to be respectful, and to listen. And as we think about this program, funded through the generous support of the Mellon Foundation monies on campus, I hope both Vickie Oldham and Sofia Ali-Khan have inspired you all to both dig deep into your own history, to realize you belong here and contribute to what's here, and that we can move forward together. So thank you all so very much for being here.